For Chapter 9, we will focus on emotional and behavioral disorders. This will be things like children who are aggressive, known as behavior problems. They may act out. They may be the withdrawn, the anxious, depressed. All of those things are going to fall within this category. A really good book that I have at my house is Fostering Resilient Learners, and it talks about trauma-sensitive classrooms. When we talk about trauma, we're referring to an exceptional experience in which a powerful and dangerous event overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. So we're not necessarily focusing on what the traumatic event is or the event itself, but the impact that whatever that event is has on the person. 52% of children between the ages of 2 and 5 have experienced a severe stressor in their life. And one of those stressors could be something like child abuse. We know that child abuse occurs every 10 seconds in the U.S. In 2010, suicide was the second leading cause of death between the ages of 12 to 17. And that was a long time ago with a lot less stressors. Trauma is in fact toxic to the brain. When we experience trauma or stress or anxiety, we do one of three things. We fight, flight, or freeze. Toxic stress can damage the actual architecture of the developing brain, and that can be extremely dangerous, especially when it occurs to children or brains that are still growing. Childhood trauma is in fact an epidemic. Between 75 and 80% of children who have an emotional disturbance fail to get services that they need or help. That's often because it's unidentified. Now today we have a lot of stressors, and I would say we are all kind of going through trauma. So we should really be practicing trauma-informed care and education across the board to everyone. Besides just family struggles in general and money, things that are kind of normal day-to-day things, there's been a pandemic going on for the past 2-3 years, and we have had mask mandates, we've had school shutdowns, we've had work shut down, jobs disappeared, people working from homes. All of this has caused a lot of anxiety and stress and depression in adults. Have we considered how it has affected young children and students? Because those are the ones who have seemed to be struggling without anyone noticing or doing anything about it. Our world seems to be very segregated right now. It can be politically segregated. There are lots of different things going on in social media that causes more anxiety and trauma. And in addition to that, there's even a war happening. So it's not currently in our backyard, but it's still something that we can't really hide from our students and young children. With all of these things considered, it's no surprise that anxiety, depression, and these emotional disorders are through the roof right now. Even without all of those things that we previously discussed, you might think, how stressful can a child's life possibly be? I know that my own children are hyper-focused on grades and tests and performance, and this is in despite of mine and my husband's focus on grades. We want them to do well and try their best. We're not focused on getting straight A's. They don't get paid for grades or doing well, but it's still the climate of the schools and their culture. So everything is very focused on getting straight A's, rewarding those who get straight A's with donut parties, pizza parties for the highest performing class on a test. Everything's kind of set up with these natural consequences or rewards in place. Besides that, many schools and classrooms have something like you see on the very first picture of a behavior modification system that's very public. And it may be a chart like this, or it could be something like Class Dojo or another technological one or a homemade one, and it's a behavior chart, and the teacher decides who has whose behavior is in what category, if they're the green or the yellow or the red. The teacher decides when they move, not the child. So the teachers really seems to be in charge of behavior, not necessarily the child. But yet the ultimate goal is that that child be in control of their own behavior. So that can be really confusing. And this is one of the things that leads to a lot of problems and unnecessary stress. But yet you see them everywhere in every classroom. The CDC has this graphic on their website in the area of mental health. And you can see there are 3 different categories: depression, anxiety, and behavioral disorders. And they're separated with 3 categories of ages, and the percentage of prevalence is on the left. So in depression, the blues, you see a very little line of 3 to 5-year-olds who are depressed or dealing with depression, and that's good. We don't want a lot of depressed children. But look at the jump it makes in 6 to 11-year-olds. So in how many years? It's almost, I don't even know, that's gone from like 1 to 2, almost 2. And then look at the huge jump from the 12 to 17 category. It goes up again. So we're seeing a big increase across the ages in each one of these categories, except for the last one. Behavior disorders seems to be highest in the 6 to 11-year-olds. And then it goes down from 12 to 17. And there are multiple reasons for that as well. Anxiety seems to be the one that is the scariest to me. And this is the one that we're seeing more and more prevalent as the years go on. One thing that I've noticed in each one of these age categories that has been the biggest impact is throughout these ages, children have gone to school. They've had more grades, more experience in school, more experience in society with friends and social situations. So that should tell us a lot too. This past fall 2021, the Surgeon General actually declared a national emergency in child and adolescent mental health. And that's pretty sad. This is a snippet from that report. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, mental health challenges were the leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes in young people, with up to 1 in 5 children ages 3 to 17 in the U.S. having a mental, emotional, or developmental or behavioral disorder. Additionally, from 2009 to 2019, the share of high school students who reported persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased by 40% to more than 1 in 3 students. So in 10 years, it went a huge jump. 40% of high schoolers had a feeling of just hopelessness. Why would a 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old feel completely hopeless in high school? This is a very serious problem that our nation is experiencing. Your chapter talks about many different disorders that fall in the category of emotional or behavioral disorder, but in general, we're not going to go over all of them. So what an emotional or developmental disorder is a chronic condition characterized by behaviors that significantly differ from age norms and community standards to such a degree that educational performance is adversely affected. So this isn't something that is sometimes. This isn't in math class I get nervous because I don't do well in math. This is some sort of behavior. It could be excessive worry. It could be self-doubt. It could be acting out, screaming, yelling, aggression, but it happens so much that school and or educational performance is what is affected. So it's not just your everyday worry or your everyday anger. It's something more. An emotional disturbance is used when you're referring to an individual with an emotional or behavioral disorder. We don't tend to use emotional disturbance anymore. Instead, you see emotional or behavioral disorders. Then there's the term socially maladjusted and conduct disorder. So it's important that you get comfortable with both of these because They show up in a few other sections of this chapter. It seems that in the past, emotional disturbance was more widely accepted and used, but now we tend to use emotional disorder instead of emotional disturbance. These are just the characteristics of what that means. And again, like I stated in the previous slide, it's more than a temporary response. It's a consistent in more than two settings, in which one is usually school related. It's not fixed with direct intervention in general education. So anything that a general teacher would do isn't enough, and it would be insufficient. So these are things that you need a little more support with. That could be an IEP or a 504 plan, but not always. It could just be a different type of intervention, because not everyone who has an emotional or behavioral disorder does qualify for, I should say that if they have a disorder, and it could qualify for a 504 plan or an IEP, but if they had a psychiatric diagnosis of anxiety, it doesn't mean that they require an IEP unless school is affected. One of the things that is important to know from this chapter is, are you talking about an externalizing disorder or an internalizing disorder? And you see these two graphics on the right. Externalizing disorder would be characterized by aggression, disruptive behavior, acting out. Think that top graphic. So a bully, hitting, throwing, yelling, cursing, things that you're not going to miss. You could, but in general, you're not going to miss. Internalizing disorders like anxiety, depression, sometimes they're not as noticeable and often missed, like the graphic on the bottom. This poor little girl is saying, I worry, I don't have anything to worry about. So this is more quiet, fearful, withdrawn, very easy to miss. In the past, emotional disturbances, as they were called, were something that schools were very unfamiliar with, and it was almost excluded. The historical roots were sort of intertwined with the medical field and psychiatry and psychology, even intellectual disabilities. So school didn't really know what to do with them, and they were excluded. It was something to deal with outside of school and not a part of school, and school didn't really know how to work with these disabilities. They were also very highly stigmatized in the past, and although it says this was in the past, I'd say they're still stigmatized today, although we are getting better discussing mental health and whole child health, so not just the intellectual abilities of students, but the physical development, the emotional development, and the mental development. So we're going in the right direction. Only about 0.5% of school agers are currently receiving special education services for emotional or behavioral disorders. But current research shows that 3 to 5, possibly 6% of school-age children and youth exhibit serious and persistent problems. So we're seeing a huge influx in behavioral problems, in referrals, in teachers saying this child is out of control, I can't get them, nothing I'm doing is working, they won't focus, they won't stop this behavior, or I can't get them to do the work, whatever it is. That is going up, but only 0.5, less than 1%, are receiving the services they need. So that's what we're talking about when we say we're missing and not identifying the needs of a lot of children and individuals who are actually having a lot of these disorders. There could be biological risk factors for some of these disorders. When we talk about bipolar, schizophrenia, OCD, or Tourette's, those are all genetically influenced disorders that fall in the category of emotional or behavioral disorders. There could be environmental components or other risk factors. Poverty is a significant risk factor of emotional disorders. So are things like child maltreatment or child abuse, which we mentioned previously. Environmental factors could be such as a lot of arguing going on in the home, parents' mental illness or mental illness in the family, criminal behavior that's going on in the home, even just the home environment in general and its stability. All of those things can lead to emotional disorders. When we get to the idea of prevention, a lot of research is done on resiliency and what resiliency is for and is it necessary. And what we're coming to realize in like this book to the left is families had previously focused a lot on some skills that are no longer the focus of families. Children were often taught to take risks, problem solve, try things out for themselves. And we've gotten further and further away from that. I'll give you an example. When I was little, I used to play outside, and I played outside a lot. I would get together with the neighbors, and we would decide what we were going to do. We would say, let's go on a bike ride, or let's play in the woods. We would build a fort. We had to think critically about what we were going to do. We had to make a decision. We had to make a plan. Sometimes we didn't agree, and we had to figure out a way to agree or change the plan. We played kickball, and we didn't have an umpire, yet we played well together. There were disagreements, and you settled them, and you moved on. All of those things aren't really done anymore. Children are more segregated than ever. They're on technology. They're in their rooms. They're on their phones. They're not practicing those social skills like critical thinking, conflict management, creativity, out of the box thinking. And those skills are very important. Those skills are what builds a child's resiliency, or the ability for them to bounce back and handle disappointment and move on and try new things. This book talks about 7 skills that children need to be successful. And these 7 skills are not related to the information on the slide, but I really like this book. The 7 skills, I can't think of all of them off the top of my head, but one is problem solving, one is risk taking. So in your textbook, they talk about these 4 researchers, Janice, Henderson, 3, and Milstein, and they identified these 4 attributes of resilient children. So resilient children tend to not have emotional disabilities or handle emotional disappointment, behavioral disorders much better. And these attributes are being socially competent and developing relationships with peers and adults, problem solving skills, getting help when they need it, finding out where to get the help, being autonomous and having a strong identity, working independently, and being self-confident, and wanting and aspiring to do big things and have goals and develop clear goals. There is a lot of research on possibly preventing emotional or behavioral disorders. And that's good because we're seeing an increase in these. But can you really prevent them? Not all the time. There are things that research shows you can put in place. A big buzzword you may hear of now is PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Strategies, I believe. I hear it all the time in my district. PBIS, this is PBIS based, or this is because of PBIS. And all that is positive behavior support. It's an alternative approach to punishment. It's usually school-wide and it's proactive, trying to address problematic behaviors before they occur. Sounds great. The problem is I hear it a lot, and if I read what that model is, whatever's happening at the school is not really aligned with it. So instead, my child's school will give out tickets to students who are good. My son gets them all the time and says, I got a pride ticket. And I said, oh, for what? He says, I don't know. So the students who are doing the right things, like listening, lining up, being nice to people, they're getting pride tickets. But guess what? The students who are getting rewarded with pride tickets are the ones who don't need these tools. It's the students who don't know how to have those pro-social behaviors, how to problem solve and make friends and get along and not hit. Those students are never getting the pride tickets, so they're never getting the rewards. But all the school seems to be doing is rewarding the children who already have the skills, thereby creating more of a divide between the good students and the quote-unquote bad students. Aren't the troubled students never going to get the rewards because we're not teaching them how to be socially accepted and how to get along? Those are the tools you need to be teaching, not just giving away a pride ticket for a reward for a free blizzard. So in my opinion, it's often misused and not done effectively. Then they talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, which are just different interventions for when there are difficult behaviors. And it's illustrated in your book on page 275 in a pyramid. And it goes up in severity with primary prevention at the bottom. Again, sounds great on paper, but is it actually working? Children and youth who have emotional or behavioral disorders do have specific characteristics that are kind of like red flags. They have very typical learning styles, certain social characteristics, and even common language and communication characteristics. Unfortunately, children who have emotional and behavioral challenges often struggle with grades and have terrible dropout rates. They don't come to school as often. Their graduation rates are not good. This makes a lot of sense, though. If you're the child who's labeled as the trouble kid or the disruptive kid, and you're always on red, and you're always pointed out, and you're always sent to the hallway, and you're always punished, and you're never getting any pride tickets, what's the incentive for being at school? Why do you want to be there? What is that school telling you? That you're the bad kid and you don't belong. On the other side, if you look at it from the anxious side, the depressed side, the internalizing side, these children are upset and worried, but it's all internal. And they're consistently worried about someone at school judging them or a violent act happening at their school. They're so consumed with the idea of safety, security, acceptance that they can't even begin to learn, so their grades struggle as well. Socially, it can be similar. These children tend to be, they may be a part of bullying. They may be a part of aggressive scenarios. They may be handling and dealing with rejection. It could be on either side, and it could show up as early childhood in preschool and kindergarten. And all too often, these children are labeled. Individuals with these disorders typically use fewer words per sentence and have difficulty staying on topic, or they use a language that's inappropriate to social conversation. So they may be socially awkward in a sense and not know what to say or not know how to say it appropriately. But again, these things are just some examples of characteristics, and it's not across the board with every disorder, but in general. When you are assessing students to see, and again, you probably won't be actually assessing them, but it's important to know that when assessments are made, that it's best to use a variety of methods. So you don't just want to do one checklist. You want to use rating skills, interviews from teachers. You want the student to fill out a scale or a survey, and you want to do classroom observations. You want to gather these from a variety of people, the student, their peers, parents, teachers. You want to get a whole picture or a multi-method approach of this student. You don't just want to watch for 15 minutes in math one day. That's not going to give you an accurate picture. And all too often in the education system, when someone comes out to do an assessment, that's all the time that they have. Sometimes that child's having a really good day or a really bad day, and that assessment can work for them or against them. There are a lot of different types of assessments. There are person-centered assessments. So using like a basis for that person's future on around their strengths, their needs, and their preferences, and kind of centered around them. And there are strength-based assessments that focus on their abilities and accomplishments rather than on what they cannot do yet. And then there are things like functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. So these are something that you will probably run into if you'll go into teaching or into special education. The best way to show them, and you may know this from child behavior and guidance, or maybe your first education course, we talk about communication a lot. And behavior is a form of communication. So before you try to implement a plan to change a behavior, you have to figure out why the behavior is happening. And we look at this ABC model. So this is a form I just found online, and it's going to ask you to write in the time, the date, the time, the activity, or where this behavior, where the child you're watching is, and then what happens right before. That's the antecedent. Antecedent is what happens right before the event. Behavior is what happens, and the consequence is what happens after. It doesn't have to be positive or negative, but there's always going to be a consequence or an effect of after the behavior. So for example, let's say we are filling this out and Susie is the little girl that you're watching, and Susie tends to hit a lot. So you're watching Susie, you're not the teacher, you're just observing. If you're a co-teacher and you're doing the ABC behavior form for them. Watch Susie, and she goes and she sits down in a small group, and she chooses a seat that's furthest from the group, but they're all at the same table. And so you would write that small group table as the environment. Then Billy comes over and chooses a seat right next to Susie and pulls his seat over close to her. And so that would be the antecedent. That's what's happening before, because then Susie hits Billy. Well, after that, what happens? Does Billy yell? Does Susie get in trouble? Does Susie get sent to the hallway? That's the consequence. You need to separate the behavior and focus on one behavior at a time. So we're focusing on hitting, and then see, why is this hitting happening? Because after a while, you'll start to see patterns. For example, maybe Susie's hitting because she doesn't like people close to her. And you notice that, gosh, it works, because every time Susie hits, it's when someone gets too close to her, and then we separate her from the group so she's getting exactly what she wants. Maybe Susie will stop hitting if you just give her her own space and her own desk and tell other people they need to give her so much space around her. That could work. It could solve your whole problem. Then she's not labeled as the bad kid. This is just another form, an antecedent behavior and consequence form. This one has a key at the bottom. So instead of writing all of that information, you could see like A says reading lesson, B says writing lesson. These could work for your environment, but they may not. C says new task in the second category. In the third category, C says yelling or screaming. So you could fill these out with just this key instead of writing everything out. And I guarantee if you focus on one behavior at a time and the ABC approach, you'll start to see some patterns. What are some educational considerations that we should have in place for students who are dealing with these emotional or behavioral disorders. Too often, the best place for children with severe emotional or behavioral disorders is in a separate group or a separate school. Again, we're talking about the most severe, but during the 2016-2017 school year, approximately 5 out of 10 students with emotional or behavioral disorders were receiving a special education in the general classroom. So that's about 47%. That's pretty good. Yet, relative to other students with disabilities, children and youth with emotional or behavioral disorders are more likely to be educated in separate schools, residential settings, home hospital settings, or other environments. And that's 17% of them. So it's not a whole bunch, but it is amongst the higher for other categories and other disorders. Let's say that there is a child in your classroom and they're dealing with one of these emotional or behavioral disorders and it's in their life. What can we do? There are a lot of things that teachers can implement, and you don't have to be on an IEP or have a 504 to do some of these things. A lot of it, to me as a teacher, is common sense. If behavior is communication, what is the behavior telling us? It's usually telling us, I can't do what you're asking, or I'm too bored, or this environment is telling me to run, and you need to change the way it's set up because every time I come in here, it looks like a racetrack and my eyes just want to run. Or there's a lot of things out for me to touch, and every time I touch them, you yell at me. Change the environment. You can also change just the amount of time that a student has. Give them more wait time or a specific individual schedule. Give them additional instruction in time management. Teach them how to manage their time if they're older. Sometimes just transitions are the hard part. So warning a child that after 12 o'clock, if they're telling time, I'm going to give a 5-minute warning and then we're going to wrap up and we're going to move on to math. That is just enough sometimes for children who struggle with transitions. And usually the disorders that we're talking about, they struggle with transitions or change. And that is a very difficult thing for emotional disorders. You could also just have the classroom arranged in a way that it's not super loud or disruptive. We tend to think that bright colors and lots of decorations are best because it makes a cute classroom. But for a lot of emotional disorders or behavioral disorders, that can be extremely overwhelming. So more neutral colors, more subdued, calm environments are much, much better. And they tend to be better for all students, not just the students that we're talking about in Chapter 9. There are academic and instructional interventions and certain curriculum and certain ways to deliver the curriculum that you can alter for students with emotional and behavioral disorders. So, in Public Law 108-446, it states that students with disabilities have to have access to the general education curriculum. So that means that for students with emotional or behavioral disorders, it may be necessary to give them appropriate supports and curriculum modifications so that they can access that curriculum. It could mean that maybe they don't do as many problems. They cover the same standards, they cover the same work, but they don't have to do 20 math problems because someone who's very anxious and worries about getting things right will do one problem 7 times to make sure it is the right way. So for my little girl who's 13 and struggles with anxiety, that's one of her accommodations, not having as much homework, not having as much workload. And it really helped her anxiety because she used to stay up past midnight to try to get everything done and make sure it was right. And that's not good for her mental health. She's still covering the same curriculum and the same problems and doing the same things. She's just not doing as many. There are some self-monitoring strategies like kind of rating themselves, recording their own efforts, getting some feedback back and forth between the student and teachers. That's obviously something for older children, probably I would say third grade and up, but under third grade that could get a little trickier. And then there may be things like an instructional aid designated to certain children who helps them understand certain ideas, vocabulary, an accommodation like that can absolutely help some students. I'm going to play a video for you that shows 4 girls, and they're kind of having a disagreement over who gets to water the plants and which plants. And what I want you to notice, because I'm not going to say if any of them or who is identified as having any disorders, I want you to notice how much I intervene and how I intervene and when I intervene, and how these girls are given the opportunity to practice conflict management amongst themselves. Because one of the most important tools that I give my students is the opportunity, I hope, to practice conflict management, critical thinking, and problem solving. I don't want to swoop in and solve their problems for them, because then I know that they are not capable of doing it on their own. These things must be practiced, and without giving them an opportunity to practice them, they won't be able to do it when I am not there. And my goal is to kind of phase myself out of the classroom and have them exist and problem solve and make good choices on their own, not just when an adult or teacher is there. So here is this video.
Can you please open the egg that I want to open?
Do you need help opening the eggs? Okay.
Oh, I got this one.
Dang. Thank you for helping them, Avery.
I was growing the flowers.
That one doesn't need a lot. Now, we're having a problem because Evelyn needs to water the one over there. So can you move the chair for her? Wait.
I want to do it.
Do you think if you're all holding it, I don't think anyone can move it. So we could ask Evelyn. Evelyn, who do you want to move the chair? Okay, so in that video, can you point to the one you want to help you with the chair? Oh, Evelyn wants to do the chair herself. Put the chair down. All right, so I need Evelyn. Give the watering can to Harper to hold. Evelyn will move the chair herself. Hold it. Evelyn, move it all the way over there by the lights. That way. Yep. Put it all the way against the wall. Yeah. I'll move this table. She's getting it. Now, we'll bring the watering can, and then you do that one up there, okay? This one is the one that needs water. Okay, so in that video, I hope that you noticed some accommodations and some modifications that were made from the teacher, and making sure that each child had an opportunity to practice those self-help skills, confidence skills, those things that must be practiced. This is another video of the outdoor classroom, and you'll hopefully see that the children are having an opportunity exercising how to conflict manage and listen to each other and make good choices. So this scenario could absolutely be looked at or handled one way, and instead, it was kind of left up to the children to handle with some guidance and a little bit of modification. Here's this one.
That was nice of you to remind her, Hunter. It was nice of you to remind her to use those to stay safe. She might need a reminder of the rules.
I'll come help you. It's not funny. Let's go. That way. That way. That way. Stop it. It's not funny.
Emma, it looks like everybody wants you to go to the other end. We take one turn on the bridge, and then you have to get in line again.
It's making me mad.
I can tell, and I think she knows too, because it looks like she's listening, and she doesn't want to hurt your feelings. But she can take another turn. Well, in the line. You need help, Emma?
Okay, so those are 2 videos from my preschool classroom that hopefully illustrate how you can practice some accommodations and maybe just alternating the environment or giving children opportunity and tools to self-monitor themselves and instead of punishing or rewarding. There are some things in the technology category that can be used for individuals who have emotional or behavioral disorders. There are some self-monitoring tools that you could use. I know you could simply just have a checklist or a little individual schedule, little thing to keep on task. Those tend to help, but there's devices too. And those are sometimes like, I think the Motivator, like Motivader, Motivator is kind of like a pager, and it helps keep students on task and remind them what's coming next. They can program different reminders with vibrations and alerts. There are also apps like Class Dojo that I kind of mentioned because I don't really like it. In my opinion, it's kind of just a behavior modification system like the flip chart on the wall, but it's a computer-based program that teachers then put up on their smartboard. And if a child does something good, they reward them with a point, and the whole school, the whole class hears ta-da, and it goes up a point. If a child does something bad or is talking during class or they need corrected, that teacher can give, take away a point, and it goes womp womp. And it's, to me, very negative. I don't find it positive at all. However, I use Class Dojo because it's a great app for communication. I can share pictures and updates and reminders. I just don't use the point system for behavior at all. So that part can be deactivated, and it can be used just as a communication tool. I can share handouts and photos of our day. I just don't use the rewards and punishment points, and parents love it. However, I feel like when you start doing the point system and those rewards and punishments, you're just doing the same thing that I described before. Well, from previous chapters, but all this is a strategy to implement to determine whether or not a student has a disability. So different instructional interventions are put in place, and then there is an assessment to see if the student has done better or has it changed at all? Is it worse? And that's just the response. How did that student respond to the interventions that were in place? Did you give them more wait time? Did you shorten assignments? If that worked, then that would say, oh, the student would benefit from that. In the event that a student is aggressive, physical, confrontational, there are physical strengths. Not strengths, restraints, I'm so sorry, physical restraints that can be used. And teachers, and especially intervention specialists who work with children like this, are taught the proper ways to restrain. However, the restriction of a student's freedom of movement, physical activity, or access to their body is what a physical restraint is. It's a very controversial topic. Sometimes you see these in the news that they're not properly done, or a child was restrained and they shouldn't have been. However, I will say I have seen children who have had to be restrained for the safety of other people or themselves. So it is something that definitely can be helpful if done the right way. And then seclusion is just confinement of a student, either removing them from a situation or putting them in a safer area so that they are safe from you're keeping others safe, or you're keeping them safe from themselves. This is, again, can be very controversial because sometimes we only hear about the negative or the bad that show up in the news. It can be done well. I personally don't use any of these, so I can't comment too much on them, but those three are ones that you need to know that are out there and of hot topics. If we know behavior is communication, what I would stress to you is when you're seeing bad behavior or interesting behavior or odd behavior, ask yourself, what are they trying to tell me? Because right now, our students are faced with a lot of violence, a lot of threats, a lot of drug issues, and a lot of social media. Bullying is it's over the top in statistics. Mental health issues, over the top. You know what else? Standards and testing through the roof. The stress and importance of grades. So how could all of these things be up through the roof and we see no connection to them? There must be. I mean, what is school for? What is the purpose of school? We know that the purpose of school is not to give tools of training to prepare students to join the workforce, because we don't know what jobs are going to exist when they get into the workforce. So it's not that. In the past, school was really a place to have students learn how to be productive contributors of society, to work together, to learn, to make good choices, to add to community and society. But I don't know that that's what the focus is anymore. What can teachers do now? And that's going to be your biggest challenge. What can we do when we're faced with such an increase of emotional and behavioral disorders? Something's got to change. We can't continue on this path. So in a perfect world, my answer would be to drop tests, drop grades, drop test scores and standards, and take care of the whole child. Let teachers teach and teach what they know, and let them focus on the whole child, the mental, the physical, the intellectual, the individual. I know that can't happen, but you can create a classroom climate where you don't do rewards or punishment or hang accomplishments on the wall, and then you don't divide and point out those who aren't as successful and those who are. You could do a lot of things to create a positive community. And I will leave you with a couple things. So first of all, my daughter's volleyball team. She is on a competitive junior Olympic volleyball team, which is just club volleyball outside of school. There are 9 girls on the team. They're 12 to 13 years old, and they're all 7th graders. They come from 5 different schools. They're all from middle to upper middle class suburbs it's kind of out in the country, so there aren't a lot of more rural areas than city. But out of those 9 girls, 4 of them are on prescription medication and seeking treatment for either anxiety or depression. 4 out of 9. And these are well-adjusted, good families, great resources around them. On paper, you would be shocked to learn this. None of those red flags that we just went through, except school environment and the last 3 years of craziness. So I think that says a lot. And I think personally that this is something we're going to see even go up more than it already has. Emotional and behavioral disorders. And we know that these are often undiagnosed or missed. So this is something that teachers have been dealing with the past forever, but has gotten worse within the past 10 years. And in my opinion, it will continue to grow. And it will take some very big changes in the education world to really focus and help these students. That's where I leave you with more resources. These are 4 really good books for every teacher, whether in preschool, high school, junior high, college, and depending on what you're teaching, if you're a speech therapist, if you're a classroom teacher, or you're an intervention specialist. The Whole Brain Child, Why Smart Kids Worry, because anxiety is through the roof, Fostering Resilient Learners, and The Inclusive Classroom. And I would add them to your bookshelf immediately because they are all wonderful. I also have 2 resources from Becky Bailey. She is a psychologist who's known in the early childhood education world more, but in the education world, and she's a speaker. She has a ton of resources and a ton of books, and I'm not saying you have to go and buy all of her books. None of these listed are by her, but she talks a lot about behavior and guidance. And these 2 links are very helpful. The first one is about how to deal with temper tantrums, and it comes more from a parenting perspective, but it could still work in a classroom, but in a young child classroom under 3rd grade, I would say. The last one is about how the brain works in times of trauma and anxiety. So wiring the brain for success. You really have to know how the brain handles stressors and anxiety before you begin to change and implement things to help children who are struggling with emotional or behavioral disorders. So please check those out. And as always, contact me if you have any questions.